Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist Ben Gallagher. This one's the sixth one in the disease series. This one's on vaccines, and then we also look at herd immunity. Now, it's really important before you watch this one that you've watched disease 5, which is on white blood cells and the immune response. If you haven't watched that one and you don't understand how lymphocytes work, then you're not going to understand how vaccines work. So if you haven't watched that one, stop now, go back and watch that one, then come back to this one. It's from the GCSE specification, and as always, I'll ask that you please do subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep updated on my videos. Thank you. So let's talk about what vaccines are then. So the first key point about them is that vaccines lead to immunity. Now remember from the last video what immunity is. We'll run through that again in a minute. But immunity at its most basic is where you've had an illness once and you can't have it again. Now vaccines can do that. But vaccines do it without the dangers of actually having a disease. Normally, you have the disease, you get ill. If you survive the disease, you'll have an immune memory and you'll be able to fight it off. With vaccines, you don't have that initial illness, so there isn't the risk of you dying, but you're just as likely to get the same immunity. Now, let's just quickly recap how natural immunity works. It's through a lymphocyte response. Now, what happens there is that you create these memory cells by having the initial lymphocyte. That lymphocyte floats around your body. If it encounters a pathogen, it gets this lymphocyte response where it undergoes rapid mitosis. You get loads of identical cloned copies, all producing antibodies. And remember, those antibodies work by locking onto the pathogen, and they can either directly kill it, or they can attract phagocytes, which come and quickly eat the pathogens. Basically, what we're saying is a lymphocyte response dramatically speeds up the response that phagocytes can come and destroy all the pathogens. What antibodies can also do, remember, is lock onto any toxins or poisons that the pathogens are creating and neutralize them. So effectively, you've taken away the weapons of the pathogen by neutralizing its toxins. Now, how that results in immunity is that some of those cells remain. Over time, a lot of them die, but some of them stay, and those are the memory cells. Memory cells are just copies of the original lymphocyte you can see up there. And what that means is if a pathogen gets into you for a second time, now that you've got loads and loads of copies of the lymphocyte that's specific to that pathogen, they're more likely to spot it really quickly. One of them's more likely to engage with the pathogen, have its lymphocyte response, make loads of copies, make loads and loads of antibodies, and deal with that pathogen before it has a chance to make you ill. So it's not that you don't get the disease a second time, it's that you can get the pathogen, but your body deals with it so quickly that you wouldn't even know you've had it. You don't have time to develop the symptoms. So all we're saying really in this green box over here is that you're immune to a pathogen if your body can respond to it and destroy it before it has a chance to establish itself enough to make you ill. That's the really key thing. And as the paragraph up there says, it's just because the numbers are so much higher that they can recognize it faster, deal with it quicker. Now, if we're looking at vaccines, vaccines do exactly the same thing as the live pathogen over there. But with a vaccine, you might have something like this little grey one up above me, the very pale version of the pathogen that's over there. Now, I've drawn that much paler and grey because that's representing a weakened version of the pathogen, a version that isn't strong enough anymore to make you ill, to infect you, to cause any bother. But because it's the same shape and it has the same antigens on its surface, it can still lock onto that lymphocyte. It can still trigger the immune response. The cells can still multiply and fight off the weakened version. Then most of them die away and still leave you with those memory cells. This diagram above me here is identical to that one over there. The end result is the same, whether it's the full-on dangerous pathogen or the weakened version that shouldn't cause you any illness. Now, there's a second version of a vaccine. Instead of a weakened one, what you could do is just use pieces of the pathogen. So if you look now at the diagram, I've just got the corner chunk of the pathogen, the piece that actually engages with the antibody on the lymphocyte. So what I can do is take some of the pathogen, the actual nasty pathogen, use digestive enzymes to chop it up all into bits, and just inject the harmless pieces into somebody. The pieces could still bind to lymphocytes, still cause the immune response, and still end up with these memory cells. So those are the two main vaccines you can have. Basically what we're saying is they cause the same immune response as an actual pathogen, but aren't enough to cause the illness. So really, vaccines, they stimulate the creation of immune memory without the need for the person to have suffered the illness. Because if you suffer the illness, there's a chance you could die from the illness. So just a much safer way of establishing immunity. So we're going to take a couple of slides now to look at the historical impact of vaccines. We're going to look at some of the historical development very, very quickly on this slide. And then on the next slide, we're going to look at the impacts of some vaccination programs. In the exam, this is how they're likely to present information. They'll give you information and ask you to apply your knowledge of vaccines and immunity to those. But let's look at a little bit of history first. So the first vaccine was developed against something called smallpox. Now, there's a picture of smallpox victim here, the symptoms, these very bad pox marks. It was once extremely common and deadly infectious disease. There's no treatment for it. No treatment's ever been developed for smallpox, and it was fatal in 30% of cases. That's a really high death rate. This was a horrific disease. Now, in 1796, an English physician named Edward Jenner, this guy, observed that people who had contracted cowpox very rarely caught smallpox. And cowpox is a similar disease to smallpox, but it's much more milder. He just observed that sort of milkmaids and people like that who dealt with cows a lot, they'd develop cowpox, they'd get the pox marks all up their arms and stuff. But if there was smallpox around, they never seemed to catch the smallpox. So he thought, well, hang on a minute, there's something going on here. So I'm going to do some experiments. The experiments he did, ethically, very, very dodgy, but still very effective. So what he did, he deliberately gave cowpox to his gardener's 8-year-old son, a boy named James Phipps. Now that's a bit dodgy in itself, that you just kind of decide, I'm going to give a disease to that kid. I don't know whether he got permission to do that. I don't know whether the gardener knew about it. I did a little bit of research. It all seems a little bit unclear. But what he then did, 2 months after James Phipps had had the cowpox, Edward Jenner exposed him to smallpox. Now that's awful because he didn't know it was going to work. So effectively, if it hadn't worked, if his hunch that cowpox could have acted like a vaccine, then he just would have given smallpox to his gardener's 8-year-old son and killed him. So this is a really dodgy experiment. But nonetheless, what he found is that the boy didn't develop smallpox. Even after repeated exposure, this is even worse. Edward Jenner, after exposing him to smallpox and going, oh, he survived. Let's try again. He exposed him to smallpox a number of times after, but the boy never contracted smallpox. So what he kind of proved there is, right, exposure to cowpox does protect you against smallpox. So what he did, he called the procedure vaccination after vacca, which is the Latin word for cow, because of the origin of the first vaccination from the cowpox virus. So that's why we call them vaccinations. They're actually named after the cows that he used in cowpox. Now, for smallpox, it was a long time later that a vaccination program was instituted, just because of the technologies involved in trying to generate all the vaccines to create that volume of vaccine. The vaccine, of course, basically being cowpox, because cowpox is a naturally occurring weakened version of smallpox. So cowpox literally is a weakened vaccine version of smallpox. But it wasn't until 1967 that they put a sort of mass vaccination program in place around the world. That's from the World Health Organization, the WHO. So 1967, keep that in mind, because the last case of smallpox on the planet was in Somalia in 1977, 10 years. In the 1950s, by the way, there was still about 50 million reported worldwide cases of smallpox. 50 million. 10 years later, vaccination program put in place. 10 years after that, the last case of smallpox was observed on the planet. And in 1980, the World Health Organization officially announced that smallpox had been eradicated. Now that's some really compelling evidence for vaccines and for how powerful a tool they can be in getting rid of some of these deadly diseases. So this is an example. It's in your textbooks. This is one that quite often comes up in the exam, just because it might give you this, might pretty much give you this information and then ask you to interpret and say, why did this work? They'd be expecting you to say that cowpox is a weakened version of smallpox. It's strong enough to create an immune response in a lymphocyte by binding to an antibody on a lymphocyte, causing rapid mitosis, blah, 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 creation of memory cells. So it's application of knowledge to an actual real world example. Let's move on and look at some other vaccination programs and the impact that they've had. So if we pull up some graphs now, because graphs can show how diseases have dropped over time following the introduction of vaccination programs. So this graph that we've got over here is showing the reported cases of deaths, reported cases and deaths from measles, and this is in the USA. This website, Our World in Data, is a brilliant website, but quite a lot of their data is USA based, but that's really useful because USA is a massive country, massive population, so it can be quite representative for global scales. But if you look at that graph over there, you can see that the number of cases of measles, which is the blue line that goes up and down, you can see it goes up and down all over the place, okay, but the numbers are still really high. Okay, we're going right up to there sort of late 1930s, you're going over 600 cases, and that's 600 cases per 100,000. So that's a significant proportion of cases. That's like, what is that, 6% of the population, I think we're talking about there. It's a lot of cases. Now, the red line that you're looking at the bottom of that graph, that's representing deaths. Now you'll see that red line tracks very close to the bottom line. So you might think, oh, well, hardly any people die from measles. And the death rate is relatively low, given the number of cases that exist. But remember, those are per 100,000. And even if you go back to 1925, so quite near the start of the graph, the population of the US in 1925 was 125 million. So even if that red line is only showing 2 people, 2 per 100,000, in the US population, that's 2,500 people dead. 2,500 people out of the entire population. 2,500 unnecessary deaths from measles. Okay, now if we continue that graph, I reveal a bit more for the second half of the last century. You can see that the numbers drop right down. The number of cases and the number of deaths both drop right down to 0. Now, unsurprisingly, here's where a vaccination program began. This is when in the USA they rolled out a mass vaccination program that they said, right, everyone, all children are going to be vaccinated against measles from now on, and the numbers drop down significantly. Now, in the exam, you're going to be expected to analyze graphs like this. They're probably going to ask you more mathematical questions, so they'll ask you to read off the number of cases in one year compared to the number of cases in another year, and they'd ask you to work out the percentage decrease or things like that. So you need to make sure you work on your math skills, that you can apply those to graphical data like this. It could just ask you things like, can you explain why there might have been little peaks that happened there if you look sort of in the 70s, and maybe that was because fewer people were having vaccinations. Maybe there was one little outbreak in one place that have biased the whole results because it was located only in one city, and if in one city there were 100 cases, then of course that gets averaged out over the whole country and it suddenly creates little peaks. So we don't know, but there's just things you might be asked to interpret about this graph. Let's look at another chart just so I can show you one that's shown in a very different way. This is the global number of deaths per child by cause of death. And if you look at what we got here, the very pale band at the bottom, those are from things that are nothing to do with vaccines. Those would be things like accidents or genetic disorders or things like that. What we're looking at in the other ones are diseases that are either totally preventable by vaccines or at least partially preventable by vaccines. So all of the colour bands are all things that could be decreased by vaccination programs. And if you look, for most of them, since 1990, since vaccination programs have been used more and more and more, the numbers of them have gone down and down and down. But they're still there. There's still a lot of deaths that could be prevented, or at least partially prevented, by use of vaccines. Now, again, with a graph like this, you could be asked to, literally put a ruler on them, measure the size of each block, compare different blocks, and it might just ask, how do the number of deaths from measles vary from the 1990 figures to the 2000 figures? How have they decreased? Can you explain that? Blah, 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 things like that. So you just got to be prepared for any graph they give you and apply your knowledge of vaccines to that information. So one last figure to leave you with on this, though, is that the World Health Organization, the WHO, suggests that vaccinations prevent 2 to 3 million deaths per year. Okay, 2 to 3 million. If we didn't have the vaccination programs, we're talking about those people would die. Now, that figure is almost impossible to justify and to say for definite this is it, because we just don't know, because the vaccination programs are in place. Plus, people die from other things. People die from complications of different diseases. So it is an estimation, but nonetheless, we're still talking in the region of millions of deaths that are prevented by vaccination programs. So the last concept linked into vaccines is something called herd immunity. Now, when we're using the word herd, it's often applied to cows, so you get a herd of cows. But in immunity, we talk about a herd as referring just to a population. So if I put my population of humans up here, they're all healthy, they're all absolutely fine. But if one of them comes down with a pathogenic infection and becomes sick, they could pass that infection onto all the people around them. Now, remember, there's lots of different mechanisms by which diseases can be spread. There can be an airborne infection, waterborne, by direct contact, by vector. And depending on which method it is, that will determine how quickly it spreads. If it's airborne, that initial person could spread it to pretty much everyone within a day. But let's say it's something where you have to be much closer. That initial person will just spread it to the people around them. But then, of course, they'll spread it to the people around them. And those people in turn will spread it to the people that they come into contact with, and it very rapidly spreads through the whole population until everyone's sick. Now, if that's a dangerous disease, then a significant portion of this population is going to die. Certainly people who are elderly or vulnerable or have pre-existing conditions. So that's really not a good thing. So we need to hope that some people within this population have immunity. Now, that immunity can be achieved through vaccination programs. So let's say I'm going to mark up less than half of my population as immune. So less than half of my population have had their vaccination. They're immune to this disease. They can't get it. Let's see how this affects the spread of the disease. So if I put the same start guy up as having the infection, look at now who that person can pass it to. He's only got 2 people that he can pass it to because the other people around him are immune. Effectively, they're insulating him and how he can spread that disease. So if the people he infects, they can't infect many, there's only one available to them there, then they can infect people around them. And you'll notice, look, the spread is far less. There's far fewer people and the spread is far slower by who it can infect. And actually, once we get to this stage here, you might notice something over on the far side. Look at that line of immune people that I've just made flash for you. They're effectively now causing a barrier, meaning that group that I've just drawn a line around, they're totally insulated and shielded from the disease because they're basically surrounded by immune people who can't catch that disease and therefore can't pass it on to them. You've protected a whole big chunk of the population even though those people haven't been vaccinated. So what we're saying here with herd immunity is that it's achieved when enough of the population has immunity to significantly reduce the spread of a communicable disease, and in many cases totally insulate and shield some groups of people. Now that's a really, really important thing. And bear in mind, I've only marked less than half of my people as immune. You imagine if I put one of those little yellow immune markers on 90% of the people there. Chances are that first person who got sick, who got the disease, would be totally surrounded by immune people and therefore wouldn't be able to pass it on to anyone. That means that person gets sick, hopefully they get better, that's it. There was never any disease to be noticed within the population. But even if you dropped it down to like 80%, that one initial might infect one other person who might infect one other person, but then they might be totally insulated, and that might be it. There might be 3 cases. You're basically trying to surround people with immune people to reduce the spread of infection. Now, a few really important points about that though. First off, vaccination programs increase the number of immune people in the population. So the more you can vaccinate, the more immunity you've got, the better, the stronger the herd immunity will be. That limits the speed of the spread of the infection, but also how widely it spreads. You can see far less of the population here is infected, and it took longer to cause those infections. Now, the immune people act to insulate non-immune people against infection. But let's just examine that non-immune people and why there should be non-immune people. Well, there always will be. One reason for that is that vaccines aren't 100% effective. Even if you have been vaccinated against a disease, it doesn't 100% mean you won't get that disease in future. Now, apply your knowledge to that and think why. The reason is that sometimes you'll have your vaccine, pathogens go into your body, but you might be lucky, or unlucky actually, and your phagocytes might deal with it and might munch all those pathogens down before any lymphocyte that's specific to those pathogens has come across them and had an immune response. So your phagocytes will fight them off. Remember, the vaccine can't make you ill, so it could just sit there and the phagocytes will slowly munch on it. But if it didn't trigger a lymphocyte response, you're not going to have developed the memory cells, so you won't have immunity. What that means is that you would still be vulnerable. Now, that's only a very slim chance. Most vaccines are at least 95% effective. So there would only be a 5% or less chance that it didn't stimulate a lymphocyte response and not cause those memory cells. But you're still talking about a very small percentage of vaccinated people who are still vulnerable to infection. Well, herd immunity would protect them, because if they are surrounded by people who are immune, then they're not going to get it anyway. No one is going to get the disease to pass it to them. So the herd immunity will protect them. The second key group is that people who can't have vaccines due to other health conditions. Some people have immunological conditions that just means having a vaccine would trigger weird responses in their immune systems and actually cause more harm. So there's a very, very small number of people that just can't have vaccines. So they are totally reliant on herd immunity to protect them. So herd immunity, incredibly important concept, comes up in the exams quite often. And it's just about creating enough people in the population who are immune to insulate those people who aren't immune. But you need a high enough number of immune people to make herd immunity effective. Okay, from here, what I want you to go on to is something very, very cool. I remember when I first heard about monoclonal antibodies thinking, these are amazing. These have got so much potential for so many things, and they really, really do. Monoclonal antibodies are something that we can develop in laboratories to treat almost any infection. They're not a vaccine. They don't prevent you from getting ill. Monoclonal antibodies are something that can be used to treat almost any disease, almost any pathogenic disease, communicable disease, to make you better. They can also be used as antivenoms and things like that if you've been bitten by snakes. So head to that video next. It's a really, really interesting piece of biology. As I said at the start, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Like this video if you find it useful, or comment underneath if you've got any questions about it. And do head over to my Facebook page, have a look at some of the infographics on there that will really round out your biological knowledge. Thank you.